next I'd like to invite Dr. Gary Gates, who is a leading scholar at the Williams Institute at UCLA, who's going to provide us with demographic data on what LGBT parented families look like across the United States. And he's actually going to talk about the fiscal impact that these kinds of categorical exclusions of prospective parents have on the actual individual states where they exist and could possibly exist.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. So as Jen said, I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm a demographer and a bit of an economist. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of the demographic characteristics of both LGBT people raising kids as well as in particular same-sex couples. So next slide. So this is something that Charlotte briefly mentioned in her talk, but we do know that so there were I have two different surveys to give you a sense of how many, these are LGBT people actually say they're raising kids. Actually, these are lesbian and gay people. It's about a third of lesbians and 16% of gay men in the National Survey of Family Growth said that they had had a child. And among those who hadn't, as Charlotte mentioned, more than half of gay men said they'd like to have a child, and more than 40% of lesbians. In another more recent survey in 2008, we get very similar findings. About a third of lesbians say that they've had children, and about, in this case, 20%, so a fifth of gay men, said they've had a child. And what's interesting about that is that both lesbians and gay men, about 9%, said that they had adopted a child at some point in their life. Next. So one of the, I think, the media images often of gay people in general, but particularly gay people raising kids, are often very white. And in fact, all the data that we know about parenting in LGBT people and in same-sex couples shows that in fact child rearing is much more common in people of color. So particularly African Americans and Latinos and Latinas, they're twice as likely as their white counterparts to say that they've raised a child. And it's an image, I think, of LGBT parenting that we all too often don't see in the way that mainstream media covers this issue. And I always think it's a really important thing to note. So, as we said, if you go to the full LGBT population, our estimate is that there's about 1 million parents with 200,000 raising, 2 million kids. But when we look specifically at same-sex couples from U.S. Census Bureau data, the latest estimates are that there's about 112,000 same-sex couples who are raising about 250,000 children. And what's interesting about that, if you look at our map, so the darker blue is where same-sex couples are more likely to be raising children. That's a map that looks very different than if I mapped where same-sex couples are most likely to live in the United States. So, but what that also tells you is that same-sex couples are raising kids in states that have some of the most restrictive and challenging legal environments for gay and lesbian people raising children. Many of the states with relatively high fractions of same-sex couple raising kids are very both politically and socially conservative. So what about adoption? Well, in the National Survey of Family Growth, they actually, curiously, they don't ask this of men, but they ask of women whether they have adopted and whether they would consider adopting. And what's curious that in lesbian and bisexual women, they're more likely than their heterosexual counterparts both to have adopted and to say they would consider adoption. If that 46% number is true of the LGBT population in general in the United States, it means that there's an estimated 2 million potential adopted parents out there who would at least consider the idea of adoption. And I think most of our outreach does not really try to find those folks. Our argument is that they're clearly, the survey suggests that they're clearly out there. Next. So in same-sex couples, we know that they're roughly 3 times more likely to foster and 4 times more likely to adopt than their different sex counterparts. So, fostering among couples with children is still relatively rare, but you'll notice that it's over 1% of same-sex couples with kids are raising a foster child. It's less than 0.5% for different-sex couples. When we look at adoption, it's much more stark. It's among those raising kids, it's 16% of same-sex couples have an adopted child in the home, versus only about 2% of unmarried and 4% of married different-sex couples. So dramatically more likely. So we did an analysis where we tried to use some of the data that we have to extrapolate into the full population. And our estimates are that about 4%, that amounts to about 65,500 kids of the 1.5 million adopted children in the United States have a lesbian or gay parent. That accounts for about 4% of all adopted children in the United States. Next slide. For foster children, it's even a bigger percent. So it's about 10,300 children in the foster care system are living with gay or lesbian foster parents. And among foster children in non-kin families, our estimate is that about 6% of kids are being raised either by a same-sex couple or a single gay and lesbian parent. So another interesting feature that we've observed in the data, and this has been consistent actually in a couple different, over time and in a couple different data sources, is we find that same-sex couples tend to have higher rates of raising disabled kids than their different-sex counterparts. There is certainly, anecdotally, I've heard a lot from adoption and foster care professionals saying that gay people and same-sex couples are often willing to take children that have more challenges, and our data seem to bear that out a bit. It's not dramatic differences, but we do always find that percentage is a little bit higher among same-sex couples in the data. So I'm going to close by talking a little bit about the economics of all this. We did a study in which we tried to estimate what if all of the states just restricted adoption and actually restricted fostering to LGBT parent, that you wouldn't allow LGBT people to foster parent. And our estimate was that it would cost nationally about $131 million. And it varies obviously considerably depending on the size of the state, but it varies from hundreds of thousands and in some cases millions of dollars. So the point being, the states that are already creating these restrictions, it's costing them money to do that. And those costs are borne in many ways, but there's many costs that we're not actually able to quantify. And just two of them here that I'll mention, and we even heard it today, the trauma to kids of having to move frequently when you can't get them into stable homes. And that has costs both initially with that trauma, but in their life course. They're going to have a more challenging, we know that they'll have a more challenging life down the road, and that has cost to it. And finally, this was also sort of alluded to in one of the other speakers, that LGBT kids, you're possibly losing out if you're restricting the types of parents. You're potentially losing out on a possible supportive home that would have a certain level of understanding of those kids if you don't let LGBT people foster parent. And as I said, the national estimate, if you add it all up, is about $131 million. So thank you very much.